Artificial intelligence is not just changing how we work, it's redefining who gets hired, who gets left behind, and what job security really means in today's labour market. Now, there's long held assumptions about training, experience, and career progression, and I think some of these are being tested in real time. And the emerging data tells a really complex story, more than just what the headlines are suggesting. And in today's episode of the International Risk Podcast, we're discussing what's actually happening in the labour markets and what it means for all of our careers. I'm Dominic Bowen, host, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And today we're joined by Lucy Wark, a serial entrepreneur and a former McKinsey consultant. Lucy, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Dominic, and hello, listeners.
And tell us, whereabouts in the world are you joining us from today, Lucy?
Well, depending on who asks, I'm either in Australia if you're overseas. In Australia, I'm in Melbourne. And if you're in Melbourne, I live in Woodend, which is a beautiful country town about an hour out of Melbourne.
So it's funny how we have those different identities. But for anyone that doesn't know, Melbourne, clearly the best city in the world, and Woodend, just north of Melbourne, a really beautiful part of the world. So I'm jealous. Fantastic. Well, look, let's jump in. This is such an interesting topic. Another organization that generally grabs people's attention when they speak is Goldman Sachs, for obvious reasons. And, they've released some data and a lot of studies, and they've estimated that about 300 million jobs globally are going to be exposed to AI automation. And they believe that in the US alone, AI will account for at least 25% of all working hours in the near future. And in some of their other analysts, they noted that at the same time as these things sound quite dramatic and people go, oh my gosh, does that mean 25% of us are going to lose our jobs or 300 million people are going to lose their jobs? They also note that AI is expected to create jobs at the same time as removing some jobs or automating other jobs. So if we can start really broadly, how would you characterize the trends we're seeing right now affecting the labor markets? And what does our audience need to understand before we start diving into this topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people, particularly if you're in any kind of knowledge work or white collar work, are interested in and probably mildly concerned about a lot of these trends. I think something that's really important to start with is to say that we are in the first innings. I think that's a particularly important idea to keep in mind when we think about how fast this technology is developing. So ChatGPT itself is only a few years old. The next wave beyond those more chatbot style products where you have AI agents which can behave a lot more like an employee, taking on processes and workflows and really running independently rather than just running via a prompt and response mechanism, is really only 12 to 18 months old, and in terms of its deployment is still in the very, very early stages. So we are very much measuring in real time a series of changes that are occurring in the economy and being deployed in the economy. And so I think something that is really helpful to keep in mind is that we will need to keep an eye on these trends as they develop. I think something else, and you alluded to it there with the Goldman Sachs reporting, that is really useful to emphasize is that terms like exposure have an meaning in academic economics, and that meaning is not the same as the one that often occurs when you're a person on the street hearing that word. So obviously, like exposure within economics just means there are, for example, tasks which AI can be applied to within a specific role. And so when we think about what a job is usually a collection of tasks. Well, there's a suite of those tasks that AI can help with. There's a suite that are still not able to be done by AI, but that role as a whole would be considered to be AI exposed. And so I think a term, and actually something that's really important to note, is that when we talk about terms like exposure and large estimates of how many roles are going to be exposed over the next few years, the next few decades to artificial intelligence, exposure itself is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. So exposure is something that can be viewed as a double-edged sword. And if you look at a lot of the labor market economics and the literature on these topics, basically the kind of key finding is that if a new technology enters a field or a task and that technology is used to automate that task or automate that role, so it's used as a substitute for that role, then in those cases you tend to see wages and employment in that field drop. And if a new technology enters a field and that technology is used to complement within that role, so it makes people more productive, it means that effectively they are generating more output for the same amount of input, then that actually leads often to wages rising and can lead to employment rising, as well as like new jobs and new forms of employment being created. And so I think one of the things that we are sitting within at the moment is the tension between visions of the world that imagine that the impact of artificial intelligence is going to be largely an automative impact, where it is depressing wages, depressing employment, and visions of the world, maybe the techno-optimist view, which is that artificial intelligence is going to make us all vastly more productive, and out of that productivity comes whole new job descriptions, whole new forms of goods and services we can consume, and we ride off into a Keynesian economic boom or like, national self-sufficiency for our grandchildren, Keynesian economic reality.
And I think it's that tension that's really important, and I think that's something that I'm still tearing at about how different this is from past waves. Of course, everyone's comparing it to the internet and to electricity and to the railways, but those aren't necessarily the same sort of examples. It's not comparing apples with apples there, and you know. We know that about 60% of US workers today are in occupations that simply didn't exist in the 1940s. And 85% of employment growth since then has come from new technologies that have created new types of jobs. Now, I understand if we look at the 2025 data, there was about 85 million jobs that were displaced last year compared to 97 million jobs, new jobs that have emerged. So about a net increase of 12 million. I wonder, is this just a normal cycle of economic and social development that ultimately will be positive? Or is it something that could go in either direction? Where do you sit on that?
I think it's a really important question, and I think probably more relevant with this technology than any other one that we've encountered. And the reason for that is, like, if you take the example of, for example, the internet, or if you take processing tools like Microsoft Word or Excel, things which, in the case of Word or Excel, they allowed people to do work that they were already doing in a much more effective, efficient way, and to share that. And those tools plus the internet made it very easy to share that work much more quickly with others. So it sped up forms of work that were already occurring and allowed them to focus on using their intelligence on the parts of the job that were more sophisticated or cognitively challenging, because the easier, more repetitive parts of those jobs had been automated or sufficiently eased. I think the question that a lot of people have, particularly with the way that artificial intelligence has developed over the last few years, from prompt and response style chatbot, ChatGPT tools that have very wide adoption, most people and their grandma are using those, through to AI agent tools that are now allowing particularly early adopters of those to automate entire workflows, entire processes, to behave a lot more like an employee, a junior employee working for you. And the question of how far and how fast those develop into, for example, self-improving AI tools, which is what many people think is like an inflection or taking off point in AI capability. I think the question that we now have is, where in past waves of technological change, we have often used things like the education system to retrain to sit above that technology and leverage that technology. If you have artificial intelligence models that have moved from successfully matching human performance on a minority of tasks a few years ago to what most academics predict, which is successfully matching human performance on a majority of knowledge worker tasks by about 2030. Are we talking about a qualitatively different type of replacement, something that human beings are going to struggle to sit above, or retrain or train themselves to sit above and work alongside? And so I actually I think there are views that say actually capability is going to trail off, like the rapid developments that we have seen in these models will not continue in the same trend. It won't be linear. We might see a sort of a stagnation. There's also views that say actually once these models start improving themselves, which some people put at 2027, some people put it a bit later, there's going to be a takeoff in the cognitive ability of of these models, I think like that critical question helps inform, like, on a raw capability point of view, is this a qualitatively different impact than the advent of the internet or the advent of tools that made us a bit faster at things that we were already doing?
But I wonder, these teachers are getting this technology at the same time as the students. How can our education systems? I mean, we're going to talk about employers and companies and what employees themselves should be doing, but how is the education system meant to keep up as this system is evolving? So it's like trying to learn to swim as a tsunami's coming in, and the swimming coach is also learning to swim at the same time as they're teaching the kids. How are we meant to make that work? Or we just have to accept we're going to fall over and pick ourselves up and fall over?
But I think one thing that is clearly front of mind in the education system at the moment, and is not a resolved question, is critical thinking skills and what it does to the capacity to develop critical thinking skills when you have a tool at your fingertips that is much better at structuring, researching, synthesizing, and communicating, but that doesn't give you the chance to struggle with the acquisition of new knowledge, which is often what develops skills. And that's been such an important pillar of education systems for decades, that I think a lot of teachers are thinking about, on the negative side, how do we prepare children for the real economy that they're going to live in, where these tools are available, but also not rob them of the experience that their parents and their managers and bosses will have had because of coming of age in earlier versions of the education system, where they learned to struggle and develop the critical thinking skills that artificial intelligence can now substitute for or mimic. I think that's a really interesting question that a lot of teachers are struggling with. You are also seeing lots of use cases that are quite positive. So, for example, teachers like using artificial intelligence to bring to life knowledge bases and to get kids to struggle with knowledge in new ways. So there are versions of this which are substituting for critical thinking, and there are versions which are actually creating new ways to teach critical thinking and engage students at scale or an en masse in a personalized. There's that argument about, is there a risk of knowledge collapse if we're no longer incentivized to generate new knowledge? Which I think is a very interesting view of the future. I've read on these topics, one that's cited a lot is the Citrini paper, which was essentially saying, look, if there is a world where we experience large amounts of automation, which leads to the negative side of how a technology interacts with labour markets, and you see large amounts of job losses and downward pressure on wages, is there a point at which you actually are experiencing like a loss of consumer demand? Like consumers no longer have the money to spend to buy the goods and services in the economy that now AI can theoretically produce huge amounts more of. And there's even sort of within game theory and labor economics, people modeling out this problem as like, actually, if you were just acting from the perspective of companies, there is almost a prisoner's dilemma where everyone has an incentive towards automation and everyone has an incentive towards sort of making their companies as efficient as possible. But if no one is incentivized around ensuring that there is full employment and high wages, actually they lose the markets that they are trying to sell to. So I think there's a lot of really interesting prison's dilemma style medium-term future forecasts that you see in this space. Though, ironically, a lot of my writing is trying to pour cold water on those.
Yep. Well, I'd like to ask you about your writing because you've got this great blog and how not to lose your job, and I think that's a great conversation, and it's a great title, and you spent quite a lot of time. Maybe you spent quite a lot of time thinking about that, but you know, what made you feel that this was needed? There's so many people writing. There's so many people with different blogs talking about this. There's lots of podcasts dedicated to this. What's the space that you felt needed filling, and what's the questions that you're answering that no one else is answering?
I mean, I think it would be generous to say no one else is answering, but certainly I think that the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on work, labor markets, employment, jobs, and also the role that all those things play in individual lives and individual well-being and our society's functioning well, which is what I care about more. Like I think we all know that there is a change coming, and the shape and pace and nature of that change is going to have profound effects. And I think what I was observing as someone who has taught career skills and soft skills and enjoys thinking a lot about the topic of career strategy and how people can structure work to make to support the life that they want to live. That's something that I've been interested in for a long time. The gap that I was noticing a lot is between what you see in the kind of academic literature, where you have peer-reviewed, rigorous, like economist-written studies that are really trying to break down what's actually happening in the labor market. What do we know from past technological changes could be happening? What can we try to forecast based on those things and based on what we know about this technology? Like that quite rigorous, thorough methodical work that is happening in trying to understand how this technology is impacting labor markets, and then the day-to-day experience of headlines that sound really scary, of clickbait and like rage bait and fear bait type content on places like Instagram and TikTok that makes people feel like the world is about to end. And I think trying to really bridge the gap between those two conversations to say, well, what does the data actually tell us is happening right now? What are the views of where this can go in the future? And what should you as an individual do to pursue and to build a kind of AI resilient career for yourself? And that was the set of topics that I really wanted to answer with the series How Not to Lose Your Job. So when I published that series, it's very important as a caveat for listeners to say How Not to Lose Your Job, open bracket, I hope the title is a joke. So I think what I'm trying to do in that series is really for a non-economist and a non-technical reader, break down, when you read terms like capability or exposure or diffusion or like automation or augmentation or displacement, or any of those terms, like what do they actually mean? What does the data tell us is happening right now? Where could it go in the future? And then what should you do about it?
Talking about what and talking about what does it mean in your article, and we'll link to your Substack in the show notes below. But you talk about 5 areas around capability. How does AI compare to human performance? Exposure, which jobs are most exposed to AI currently? Adoption, how is it being adopted, and is it to its full potential? Economic impact, is it showing up in jobs and productivity? And then lastly, the people impact. Who are the winners and the losers so far? Out of those 5, which do we get wrong? Which are we not understanding properly? Where do you want people to really understand something more?
That's such a great question. I think on capability, I actually think capability is the picture where probably people are the most familiar with it, because a lot of us are using tools day to day, and you might have at least heard discussion of where is this going and what could it turn into. I'd say a lot of those, the next, and even I think on a topic like exposure, I think there's a lot of headlines that can be quite daunting, because a lot of like artificial intelligence tools have applicability to a large number of jobs, and the assumption that people make off the back of that is that they will automate a large number of jobs, which is not necessarily the case at all. So I'd say certainly, I think the leap from exposure to impact is the one where I think a lot of people are feeling very pessimistic, and where, at least so far, that pessimism is not necessarily fully justified. So, to summarize, like I'd say at the moment where we are on capability is capabilities are increasing rapidly. We don't know exactly the future shape of them, but we should assume that they will at least continue to improve reasonably fast. I think on exposure, we know that blue collar or sort of manual work jobs are actually pretty good. And then we know that when it comes to white collar or cognitive work or knowledge work, that the sort of the group of people who are most hard hit at the moment are people doing what you call repetitive cognitive work. And so think of that as like administrative assistant, customer support, things where there is a clear process, and that process is able to be automated and the tasks are relatively able to be automated. And so there is some exposure around those. And then when it comes to less repetitive cognitive work, so things where there's more novel challenges, it's less clear that that is able to be automated at this, or sort of less clear that that the picture is going to be automation, not augmentation, for a lot of those types of jobs at this point in time. And then when you get to something like adoption, the way I describe adoption is that it is a puddle rather than an ocean. So right now, there is extremely broad adoption of artificial intelligence tools. It's as fast or faster than the adoption of the internet and other sort of digital technologies. In the period of time that it has taken place, but most people are still using it more like a chatbot than they are like an AI agent or like an employee. And so I think there's a real sense in which everyone knows that it's there, but not necessarily that it is like driving as much productivity or as much change as it has the potential to do so far. And then when we look at the economy, you basically can't see it in the statistics at all. And so at an economic level, where we can see AI investment, so we know actually GDP is increasing because companies are investing in artificial intelligence build-outs, whether that's physical infrastructure or usage of credits or hiring of people to do those things. But actually right now, basically no noticeable impact on economic growth, productivity, or jobs or wages at an economic level. And then within the people impacts, there are like specific groups who are currently hardest hit. And the evidence is emerging, not entirely uncontested, but starting to point in a strong direction. There are people who are being impacted by it as well. I don't know if that was a long answer. Sorry, Dominic. Is it me? Yeah. So at the moment, there's probably one of the most hotly discussed debates in the entire market or in the entire literature around artificial intelligence and labor markets is something known as the canaries in the coal mine thesis, or the canaries in the coal mine paper. This is Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford. And the key finding here is that for junior workers in professions that have a lot of AI exposure, so if we remember, like the definition of exposure is lots of tasks can have AI applied to them, and he talks about software engineers, and he also talks about customer support representatives. The finding of that paper and then the subsequent series of work is actually that since the release of ChatGPT, you've seen marked declines for for junior workers in those fields, that effectively people who are doing the most sort of simple work, the most easily automated work, the work that is sort of closer, more process driven, less judgment or relationship driven, in those fields are losing employment at the moment. And so there are findings around younger workers in fields where AI has a lot of potential to be used, their employment is dropping. And so I think there is more broadly a concern and an emerging set of findings around a trend known as seniorization, which is essentially that even junior level roles, when you dig into what's being requested in job descriptions now, it's actually looking a lot more like a mid-level role, that there are things that are now assumed that you're going to be able to do, but you're being paid like a junior to do what used to be a mid-level job. So I think there's the younger workers question. There's also, interestingly, and this is a less thick literature, but there's starting to be some literature around and findings around freelancers and declines in the market for freelancing. So if you hire someone via a platform like Upwork to do sort of graphic design for you, or copywriting, or write your LinkedIn content, or whatever it is that you want someone to do on Upwork, there are declines happening in sort of hiring of freelancers on those platforms. And that's being linked as well to the ability of AI tools to do those jobs. And I think what's particularly worth calling out about those groups is that with the that is where, if there is going to be a larger trend and potentially a larger negative trend affecting the world of knowledge work over years and decades, those are the workers who you would expect to be hit hardest first. And for different reasons. For younger workers, it's because they are often sort of learning on the job. They have the least tacit knowledge, they are doing the simplest work. And so it's easily automated by technology. And for freelancers, it's a lot of this work can be done by tech, but also because they have no impact at all costs, I think has become probably a much less effective strategy in a world where the bottom rungs of that career ladder might be narrowing or changing. And similarly, seeking out credentials in fields where once upon a time the credential pretty much equaled the job. So, law or medicine or anything where you need a certificate in order to practice in a field. I think it's not necessarily the case that those roles go away, but I think the assumption that there will be demand for that supply of labor is probably one that we now need to question a bit more, because so many tasks may well be automated within those fields, even if there might be, for example, a two-speed effect happening where you have junior folks who are facing a sort of narrowing pipeline and less demand, while senior folks are actually reaping the benefits of augmentation and seeing higher wages at the top of that as well. But in terms of strategies that I think of some of those ones that I've spoken about in the past, I think strategies that I think are worth considering and that are sort of strengthening in this period rather than weakening. I think things like platform building. So building, and a platform can mean a lot of things. It can mean having a extremely popular podcast. It can mean having, becoming an influencer. It can mean something a lot simpler, like putting your writing out into the world or sharing your working in some ways. But I think building a platform for yourself where you're able to connect to people and build audiences and followings is actually a strategy that I think is becoming more and more powerful. The tools to do it and the capacity to do that rapidly is more accessible than ever. And those things act as a protection because they are not replaceable, or like your relationship with an audience is not nearly as replaceable as your ability to do a task, a simple task sort of locked in your room with a computer. Similarly, I'd say things like leverage or proximity. So proximity is digital and geographic networks, like human-to-human connections, being the owner of a relationship, having folks who you can tap into in your network is probably more powerful than ever. I would say leverage, by which I mean, like, if you're going to do the same amount of work, do it on bigger pools of capital or do it on bigger challenges. And I think actually there's a similar effect there where once upon a time it may have taken 5, 10, 50 person team to do a task. There's now maybe some slightly overblown, but there are certainly claims about like the first $1 billion company run by one person is going to be built. I think there is definitely a merit to, like, you have the ability to have a much greater scale of impact if you use these tools well, but also, like, the larger the pools of capital or the larger the areas of responsibility you're working on, the more likely it is that there is a role for oversight in that as well, because of the risks of getting it wrong and the cost of mistakes too.
No, I think that's good because you talk. I mean, you've had a very successful career. You've been a successful entrepreneur. You just talked about platform building, which I think was really interesting. I'd love to hear, even just briefly, how are you using AI to build yourself? If you're willing to let us inside your world and some of your secrets, how are you using artificial intelligence to build assets, systems, products, distribution channels, as you said, platform building, to produce value without you having to depend on you solely hour upon hour?
Yeah, I mean, to give a bit of background, like my training is as a social scientist. So I studied politics, psychology, and sociology at Cambridge, and then I did social science at UChicago as well. And so my background is breaking down complex social science research and turning it into something usable. And I think a lot of the work I've done in writing and talking has been just various different iterations of that and different topic areas. But certainly in that work, I think I have seen both incredible gains in terms of how you can use artificial intelligence as a tool. And I've also seen the areas where it is still incredibly important to have human judgment and sit down and struggle with knowledge in order to generate new knowledge. So to give you those as examples, in the work I've been doing it on artificial intelligence and labor markets, One of the things that I really wanted to do was build a pulse on what is happening in discourse and the major publications by leading experts in this area. So I've built like a Claude co-work routine that every day scans the entire internet with a set of requirements from me based on topic area, experts I'm following, outlets I care about, summarizes everything, pulls it all into one place for me, sends it to me, and basically tells me, like, here are all the papers that mattered over the last 7 days. Here's what they mean for all the debates that you care about. I've saved them all into a knowledge base, and now I have like a steadily building over time database that is telling me how this discourse is evolving as well. And so that for me has been incredibly helpful in speeding up the how do I get up a learning curve about this topic. It's something that I've been interested in, but I wanted to go deeper. And rather than like hopping online every day and doing that myself, it's been incredibly good at that. But I think the limitation of that is I actually still have to sit down and struggle and read through all of those things and do the synthesis work that is required to produce high quality summaries of those things that actually thoughtfully engages with them.
I think that's valuable, and I think that that's a really good reminder. And this is a conversation I often have with analysts and more junior employees that, you know, AI is a great sounding board, it's a great whiteboard, but you still have to do the hard work. You still have to struggle with the analysis. You still have to wear multiple hats, and each edit draft once read it as yourself, then an analyst, then a client, then read it from a variety of different angles, and you still have to go through that process. AI just doesn't replace that yet.
And also, I think there's such an important point, and coming back to what we were talking about with education, like the data on what a human remembers when they read it once versus if they like talk to someone about it versus if they have to teach it to someone. It's like, they remember a third, they remember half of it, they remember 90% of it if they have to teach it. And I do think that there is, in terms of internal knowledge generation, we all run the risk as knowledge workers of losing the muscle that allows us to struggle with the generation of new knowledge and synthesis. And I think creating opportunities for yourself to sort of speed up the parts of the process that previously took a lot of time, like gathering materials while still doing the hard parts that are required for like true learning and true understanding. I think there's a really important balance to be struck there.
I think we'll wrap it up there, but we're going to have you back on the podcast in the very near future. But thank you very much for coming on today, and thanks very much for the conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was a great conversation with Lucy Wark. I really appreciated hearing her thoughts on artificial intelligence, the future of work, and what this means for labour markets, and really what it means for all of us. Today's podcast was edited and coordinated by Alana Uribe Zuluga. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days. That was great, Lucy. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the International Risk Podcast. For more episodes and articles, visit theinternationalriskpodcast.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky and Instagram for the latest updates and to ask your questions to our host, Dominic Bowen. See you next time.